I think that the Conservative Party's relationship with the Muslim community is deeply toxic and flawed.
Why? Is it because your party is a racist party?
I think my party has over time been ideologically taken over by people who are anti-Muslim. I wasn't surprised when the far-right racist riots happened, when they attacked Muslims, when Muslims were blamed for things they hadn't done, when they were seen to be the ones that they wanted to blame, even if they weren't involved. This has been a long time coming, and it's what I have been warning about.
Do you believe the British government is complicit in war crimes in Gaza?
I think that war crimes have been committed in Gaza, and I feel that we have not done enough to stop them.
Muslims don't matter. That's not just the ever-increasing feeling for many Muslims living in countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, where Islamophobia has become the norm. It's also the name of the new book from Baroness Sayeeda Warsi, who served as Britain's first Muslim cabinet minister under the Conservative-led coalition government of David Cameron, resigning over Gaza in 2014, and more recently resigning the Conservative whip itself, saying her party has moved too far to the Islamophobic right. Muslims Don't Matter examines the realities of being Muslim in the UK, where many, especially in the wake of the recent race riots, are unsure whether Britain is still a safe place to call home and are actively putting together a plan B in case they have to leave the country. Warsi says that she will stay in the UK and fight for her, quote, rightful place in it. Ultimately, Warsi's book is a call to turn off the tap of hatred and ensure the country that her grandfather fought for and her child continues to protect will be one that future generations of Muslims feel at home in. I recently sat down with Baroness Warsi in London for a wide-ranging conversation about her new book, Islamophobia in the UK and the US, the state of Britain's Conservative Party, and of course, the genocide in Gaza. Baroness Warsi, thank you so much for doing this interview with Zateo.
Thank you for having me.
Congratulations on the book.
Thank you.
It is called, we're going to put it up there for all of you, it's called Muslims Don't Matter. So the obvious first question, why don't Muslims matter?
I think for me, this book was a moment when, in the middle of the conflict in Gaza, and I looked at the way in which policymakers were responding to the British public response to what was happening in Gaza, that actually even if people were not Muslim, but they were perceived to be Muslim, they were dehumanized. That the dehumanizing of Muslims had got to that stage that you didn't even have to be Muslim anymore to not matter. But if you were perceived to be Muslim, you too didn't matter. So I think it was, for me, something about being plus 50, something about getting to the point where I genuinely feel like I'm done. I'm done with trying to explain to people and to justify and to reason and to evidence and to do all those things that I have done for over 3 decades now in my political life, where
Condemn, disown, dissociate.
Caveat,
Yeah.
you know, all the things that we're expected to do. And I just said, look, I'm done.
So
I'm
this
done
book
with
is
it.
your FU.
It is, but it's also, I suppose, a really, it's me journaling my hurt, if that's the way young people would see it. It's me waking up and realising that the country that my grandfathers fought for, the country that my child still in uniform fights for and protects, is failing to protect me. That in this country, 4 generations on, we don't matter, we don't belong, that we're still othered, and that it doesn't matter how much blood, sweat, life we give, we are still seen as the enemy within. That even as somebody like me, who is at the heart of the establishment, The Enemy Within was the title of my earlier book, but even somebody like me who at the heart of the establishment, as a Privy Councillor, as a member of the House of Lords, still feels like I need to start looking over my shoulder. And when I speak to my very successful middle-class Muslim friends and family who are planning exit routes and plan Bs and wondering where else they could stay, that sense of fear that this place may not be a safe place, a welcoming place for my grandchildren. So was it a big FU? I think it was a combination of fear and heartbreak and wanting to sound the sirens and say to people, we've really got to change course.
Well, you definitely sound the siren in the book. You start the book by talking about the plan B, Muslim families talking about a plan B, which is interesting because obviously I'm a British Muslim now, American Muslim as well. I'm based in the US, where a lot of Muslims counting down the days to a possible second Trump presidency are having similar conversations about, well, if it's going to be really bad, what do we do? It's funny because I spoke to two British Asian public figures recently on my podcast. One was Riz Ahmed, who we both know, the other is Nish Kumar. And with both of them, the topic comes up about how we feel under siege, how we're treated. Riz and I kind of had a joke about what are our plan Bs, what are the cities we would go to if we had to flee. But I'm surprised to hear you say that the UK is at that similar stage to the US, because when I look at the UK, I think, okay, Boris Johnson was awful, Rishi Sunak, Liz Truss, the Conservative government that just got deposed was awful, but they did get defeated. They are gone, your party, I should point out, although not people I know you share views with on this stuff. But you suggest in the book that actually British Muslims are going through a very similar experience as Muslim Americans.
Yeah, and that's both based upon my own personal experience, but also sitting at the heart of policymaking. If I go back to some of the conversations that we were having in 2007, 8, 9, and I thought they were worrying conversations, they're not a patch on where we are now. If you think about the kind of organisations like the Henry Jackson Society, the Centre for Social Cohesion, individuals like Douglas Murray, who were considered to be completely beyond the pale and under a Cameron government.
Now they're all mainstream.
Exactly. Under a Cameron government, he was specifically not engaged with. And yet the Home Secretary, the ex-Home Secretary, Suella Braverman, stood at the dispatch box in the House of Commons and said he has mainstream views. So that shifting of the extreme opinion to be now considered to be mainstream in politics is deeply disturbing. And from a personal perspective, Mehdi, I'm one of 5, and 3 of them have already bought a place somewhere else.
You're talking about siblings?
And siblings. And I'm resisting. I'm saying I'm not prepared to do that. I'm going to fight for my rightful place in my country. And so I think for me, it is worrying that, interestingly, there's a new report out by a think tank called Equi, which basically says that it's actually the more socially mobile, the more financially successful part of the Muslim community, which is planning the exit routes. Those people that can are looking for elsewhere.
You touched on a lot there, and there's a lot I want to explore with you. Just in order, though, let's just start at the top, because you mentioned people being perceived as Muslim, which reminds me of the debate over Islamophobia, which has been going on for a long time. And I'm talking about the definition. This idea that, well, it doesn't exist, right? There was an argument for a long time. It's a made-up word, as if every word isn't a made-up word. It can't be a phobia, because that's a medical condition, as if we don't talk about homophobia. It can't be racism. This is the classic that I've dealt with for 20 years. I'm sure you've dealt with the same thing. You were part of the group that pushed, and is still pushing, a definition of Islamophobia. You talk about it in the book. I want to read it out. Islamophobia is rooted in racism and is a type of racism that targets expressions of Muslimness or perceived Muslimness. It is a form of anti-Muslim racism. Now, the Richard Dawkins of this world, who I've interviewed, the Sam Harrises of this world, who I've clashed with, and all the people you've clashed with, would say, don't be silly. Islamophobia is not racism because Islam is not a race. What is your response to that when you talk about this definition?
Well, the complete nonsense that somehow racism and racialization of a community is to do with the pigment in your skin just doesn't hold true. Look at any social studies academic work over the last 5 decades, and they will show you that actually the racialization, the stereotyping, the stigmatizing of a community has got nothing to do with the color of your skin. Because if it was, anti-Semitism, a form of anti-Jewish racism, would not be Jewish racism, because Jews come in as many colours as Muslims do. You have brown Jews and black Jews and Arab Jews and white Jews. So just because Muslims come in every colour that there is across the world should not prevent them from being a racialised group. And what for me is really fascinating is that 2 attacks, one happened outside Parliament where a Sikh man was attacked and called a Muslim, and a second, a dentist was viciously attacked in Wales as a revenge attack for the killing of Drummer Lee Rigby. And again, he was attacked because he was perceived to be Muslim. So this is the racialization. You don't have to be Muslim. You don't have to be brown. You don't have to be black to be subjected to an Islamophobic attack. It is the racialization of a community. And if we are still, remember, this notion of anti-Muslim racism was first introduced in the 90s by the Runnymede Trust. This is not a new concept. Yeah. But the fact that here we are in 2024 arguing about
Labour
a word,
government, Conservative government, now another Labour government, and still
arguing about the word.
We're instead of getting behind the fight against it. You, for those of our viewers, listeners watching around the world, were the most senior Muslim in government in 2011, 13 years ago, when you gave a very famous speech talking about how Islamophobia has passed the dinner table test. Just lay out for people who are not aware of that. What were you referring to?
I mean, first of all, 2011 was very early in my political career in government. And, you know, I keep saying to people that when you get into a position of power, don't spend your time being fearful of losing it. Exercise power when you're there. And for me, this speech was exercising power by saying this is a real issue, and what I could see was what I saw as this respectable form of racism, the kind of racism that you saw around the dinner tables of polite society, the way in which people say, oh, we've had some Muslims move in next door, but they're ever so nice, they're not extreme, they're quite moderate.
You're not one of those.
Kind of, this kind of demarcation of moderates and extremists all the time, the good Muslim, bad Muslim narrative, the kind of being surprised that there is a couple next door where there is one man and one woman, the fact that they don't live this perceived lifestyle that has been superimposed on what Muslims should be and are. They don't have 4 wives. Shocking. And so I think all this kind of stigmatizing of communities, this demonizing of communities, which has gone on over years and years and years, had crept into not just the dinner tables of polite society, but in think tanks, in the corridors of power.
You say in the book, respectable racism.
Respectable racism. It was the kind of thing that was all right. People would say, I mean, even people like Polly Toynbee said, I'm an Islamophobe and I'm proud of it. Yeah. And she's never disowned those
I think she
words.
may have done, but the point is at the time it was fine to say, and there was no consequences in The Guardian to saying such a thing.
Yeah.
You're right, and you called attention to it in a very eloquent way. What was the reaction at the time? You were in the Conservative coalition government. You were working for David Cameron. Did you get a backlash? Did people say, shut the hell up?
What was interesting was that the speech, once it hit the front pages of the newspapers on the morning of the afternoon that I was due to deliver that speech, was when everybody went into overdrive. And there was a huge amount of pressure put on me from Number 10 and others to change the speech at that time. And I refused to do that because ultimately, for me, it was something important that needed to be said, and was a line in the sand, and is a moment that we now go back to 13 years on to say, look, this was what the situation was. And often, I think in politics, if you can't make a difference, then make a record. Start with at least logging these moments. And part of this book, and the reason why I keep writing this, is because future generations will look back at our generation, Mehdi, you know, my generation. I'm now nearly in my mid-50s, and say, what the hell went wrong? Yeah. How did you allow it to get this bad? How were you at the seat of power and you couldn't actually make this change?
So it's a good segue into what I really need to ask you about when you say, how did you let it get this bad? It is bad. In the US, we have an openly Islamophobic former president running for president again, could very well win. Doesn't matter that he's surrounded by people like Laura Loomer who say Islam is a cancer, Muslims shouldn't be allowed to run for office. This is his close advisor who was on his plane before the debate. Here in the UK, we had horrific race riots, but not just race riots, Islamophobic riots, specifically targeting not just immigrants and brown folks, but Muslims, right? It was not a Sikh Gurdwara or a Hindu temple that was surrounded by the mob. It was a mosque in Southport where the worshippers thought they were going to die. And with politicians and journalists unable to say the I word, Islamophobia. You say, how did it get that bad? How did we go from the respectable racism of 2010, 2011, where Islamophobia is expressed through anti-terror strategies or discussions about integration, or Jack Straw saying, I'd like you to take off your face veil in my surgery, the famous Labour Foreign Secretary, to basically old school racism, the far right on the streets, Islam being called a cancer, the demonization of, quote unquote, to borrow an earlier title of yours, the enemy within. How do we get that in 10 years?
I think it's been longer than 10 years. I would say it goes back to the Blair years under the Labour government. I think the language started then. I think there's been a poisoning of the public discourse. And if you look at all the polling now in relation to British Muslims, it reflects what happened over the last 10, 15, 20 years. You can't have a situation situation where headline after headline after headline in the newspapers, where politicians use this incendiary, toxic language, where you have these discussions around whether or not, for example, Muslims are dangerous because they are groomers, they are sexual predators, and then you have a report from the Home Office which says exactly the opposite, and that the majority of child sexual exploitation is committed by white men, and you have Home Secretaries who bury that report. So, and this level of disinformation that has come out, I wasn't surprised when the far-right racist riots happened, when they attacked Muslims, when Muslims were blamed for things they hadn't done, when they were seen to be the ones that they wanted to blame, even if they weren't involved. This has been a long time coming, and it's what I have been warning about. And that's why, in some ways, I think that stark manifestation of it on the streets of our country, where people were being burnt out of their buildings, the equivalent of pogroms against Muslims was taking place. That starkness hopefully, maybe the moment when we finally realise how serious it is and we pivot.
Although once it happened, we didn't see Labour ministers saying Islamophobia very often. They had to be pushed, Yvette Cooper, into saying it. Journalists got very kind of resistant towards wanting to have an internal check. That's Labour, and you talked about it starting in the Blair years. We had Prevent and the Iraq War and 7/7 and counter-terrorism and all that, and I agree with that. But let's be honest. Right now, it is being driven on the right of the political spectrum by conservatives in the United States, and now they're mini-me's in the United Kingdom. We saw Liz Truss, former Prime Minister, former leader of your party, sharing a stage with Steve Bannon in the US while he praised Tommy Robinson, right? There was no censure from the Conservative Party, no consequences for her doing that. You saw Boris Johnson as Prime Minister talking about Muslim women in very disparaging ways, which led to a rise in hate crimes. How does someone like you, with these views, writing these books, number one, end up in the Conservative Party, at the top of the Conservative Party, and number two, why on earth are you still in the Conservative Party? Surely the low taxes only go so far.
These are really important questions. First of all, how does somebody like me make it to the top of the Conservative Party? I think the Conservative Party of today is very, very different to the Conservative Party I joined 2.5 decades ago.
You wouldn't have made it in today's Conservative Party.
I think today, to be a Muslim within the Conservative Party, you have to completely sanitize your Muslimness and your identity to make it to the top. So I would be coming up with some sort of nonsensical comments like, I was born a Muslim, but don't really practice the faith. It's not a part of my identity. It's not, I would be coming up with all that kind of rubbish. And one of the things that
imagine who you're referring to there with that quote. People can Google it.
People can Google it. And I think what would be, what I'm trying to do now with young Muslims coming into the party, and I had a meeting with a whole group of them who were on the candidates list and didn't get selected to stand at this last election, is to say to them that unless you're allowed to bring your true self, your authentic self to the table, then this is a really corrosive place to be. So where I think I still have a really healthy mindset, although it's been a very toxic relationship, is that I have never tried to hide who I am, and I have never tried to sanitize my identity. So even though it's tough and I get a lot of backlash, I get a backlash for being me rather than a version of me that isn't correct. So that,
you turned up for the first cabinet, I remember, in a shalwar kameez.
In a pink shalwar kameez, yeah.
Which weirdly Preeti Patel and Suella Braverman have never done.
I think for me, I am entirely comfortable with my various identities. And I genuinely thought, those of us that felt that multiculturalism had succeeded and would be in social mobility success stories.
But you worked for David Cameron as Prime Minister, who was anti-multiculturalism, went out of his way to attack multiculturalism. I remember in a speech in Munich while the far right were marching through Luton, a very brown town. Again, what were you doing there? How did you justify that to you? I remember a lot of people would admire you in the Muslim community, but then say, yeah, but she's in the Conservative cabinet, she's in the Conservative government, she's just in it for herself. She's in it for power, otherwise she would stand down.
Yeah, I think you have to decide when you want to make a difference. You can either do that by throwing bricks from the outside and protesting, or you can feel confident enough to say, I'm going to play my part at the centre and have all the battles on the inside. And I don't think you're any stranger to the battles that I had within the Conservative Party. Much of it was in the public domain, even during the time those battles were happening.
But you're still in the Conservative Party. This is why I came to do this interview with you in 2024. I first met you, I think, 14 years ago. What are you doing in this party? This party is like a hard right Islamophobic party. Every week we hear stories of some politician saying something ridiculous. We're meeting right now in the middle of a Conservative Party leadership contest where one of the leading candidates says that people who say Allahu Akbar in the street should get arrested. Right? You have local councils saying outrageous things, promises of investigations into Islamophobia that never really materialise. How are you surviving in this party? Why not say I'm done with it? I'm not welcome here.
Because I'm not prepared to leave the battlefield. I'm not prepared to back down. I'm not prepared to be told this is not my place. If you look at almost every single case of Islamophobia that's been called out within the Conservative Party was called out by me. The push for a public inquiry was led by me. It eventually was a bit of a whitewash, but at least we got an inquiry. The push to have the definition of Islamophobia accepted within the Conservative Party was led by me, and the Conservative Party in Scotland adopted it. Now, you might say these are small wins, but there would be no wins if people like me exited the Conservative Party. I think
it's a pragmatic position.
No, I mean, I'm a centre-right politician, right? First of all, I think if I looked at my politics as a whole, I'm a centre-right politician. But I think that the Conservative Party's relationship with the Muslim community is deeply toxic and flawed. I think it needs to be...
Why? Is it because your party is a racist party?
I think my party has over time been ideologically taken over by people who are anti-Muslim. I think that I have a joke with David Cameron where I say, Michael Gove radicalised you, David. If you go back to the David of 2006, 7, 8, 9, 10 and look at the speeches that he was writing then, that was the Conservative Party.
He went and stayed with a Muslim family, if I remember
correctly. He did in Birmingham, and he talked about how integration was a two-way street.
But then he opened the door to Gove and Brexit and Boris, and it's where we are today.
He did, but I also think that there are good people, and there continue to be amazing people in the Conservative Party.
But good people's not enough in a structure that is institutionally bigoted or institutionally Islamophobic. Would it be fair to say the Conservative Party of today is institutionally Islamophobic?
I think the party is institutionally Islamophobic. I've said that openly, and I think that it was a real shame that the inquiry, having found all the incidents of Islamophobia, failed to call it out for what it was. But I'm going to stay and fight, because I think it is important to stand on those backbenches, to speak to your colleagues, to have a direct link with the party chairman, as I did only last week and the week before, to raise these issues consistently, to speak to those people who fund your party, to say to them that this needs to change. Look, in the end, there are only two things that make a party change, right? Those people that fund it and therefore give it the resources to fight an election, and those people who vote for it. And at the last election, the Conservative Party suffered the worst defeat that it has ever suffered in history since the late 1800s. It's a wake-up call. Now, if my party choose not, if my party choose not to have that wake-up call, we'll just lose again, and then eventually we will have to find our way into the middle ground.
Or, and this is the Republican strategy in the United States, you win again through good means or ill. You have minority support and you're still able to impose your hard right agenda. And what I would ask is, and that's the worrying sign, that's where it comes back to the beginning of your book, Plan B, what happens if these freaks take over? And let me ask you a very blunt question. You've written about Islamophobia. You do a podcast with David Baddiel about anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. A Muslim and a Jew go there. What about the analogy that people have made for a long time post 9/11, but I feel like never more relevant than post these riots? If you're standing inside the mosque in Southport, I think you would feel this analogy, which is, are we in a place where we're repeating the path of 1920s, 1930s Europe? When you see what's happening in Germany and France with the far right, and when you're seeing what's happening in the UK with the Conservative Party, with the Reform Party, with the riots?
We're on the cusp of that. In the book, I talk about the Dreyfus affair and your listeners will be familiar with that. It's the case of Alfred Dreyfus, a Jew in France, who was serving in the French military, who was accused of something which he did not do. There was this bizarre trial and evidence against him, a closed trial, much like we have now often in the United Kingdom, and he was convicted, and he was stripped, I think, of his citizenship or similar, and sent off to some island off French Guiana. And he was from a wealthy, middle-class, successful family, and his family fought the case, and eventually he was exonerated and reintroduced back into the military. But it sent a feeling amongst Jews in France at that time to say, even if we are serving our country in uniform at the highest level, we are still accused of being disloyal. We are still accused of not truly French. And for me, this is so personal. I have both my grandfathers, my paternal and maternal, served in the British Indian Army. I have a child back in uniform serving this country. And it just felt very, very close to home, that story. To feel like it doesn't matter what we do, how we serve. You can serve this country. You can be on the front line. You can give your life for this country. You can break your backs in the mill towns, as our parents did.
Never be one of us.
You can serve, at the top table, as I did in cabinet. You can be a privy councillor. You can hold the secrets of this state, but you're still being told in some way you don't belong. You don't matter. And what option do you have? Well, you have two options, Mehdi. You can either do what some of my siblings and friends are doing, which is finding a place somewhere else, packing up and saying, I'm out of here. Or you can say, I'm going to stay and fight. And this book is part of my staying and fighting. Me remaining in the Conservative Party is part of me staying and fighting, because this is my country and I am not prepared to be told it's not.
One point I said earlier about people who used to criticise you in the Muslim community about she's in the Conservative cabinet. You then did become very popular with Muslims and with people on the left, even though you were a Conservative, back in 2014, during the 2014 Gaza war. You were a minister in government and you quit the government very publicly. It was a huge story at the time over Gaza. You called it a morally indefensible policy of the British government to carry on supporting and arming Israel as they were killing Palestinians at a rate that at the time seemed horrific, but now looks like nothing compared to today's genocide. You write about it in the book, and you say the war in Gaza was an inflection point where we saw with burning clarity the politicization and dismissal of Muslim concerns. The truth is, you say that Muslims don't matter unless they are villains. I feel like you writing that in the middle of this current Gaza genocide must have been a weird feeling, because whatever the dismissals were then, whatever the villainization were then, it's been steroids now post-October the 7th, is it not? I feel like we've gone backwards post-October the 7th.
Completely. I mean, if you think about the arguments that I was having within government at the time to say we need to stop arming it, sending arms to Israel, we need to call this out, we need to vote in the right way at the Human Rights Council and at the United Nations. And remember, I was the minister for the UN, for human rights, for the ICC, and the spokesperson for foreign affairs in the House of Lords. I was at the centre of this debate, and I saw every single conversation that was happening within government. And what became so obvious to me was that the British government in 2014 was simply not implementing the British policy on the Middle East. And everything I put in my resignation letter that day it rings so true. It breaks my heart to say I was absolutely on the ball when I said this is going to get worse unless we deal with the underlying issue of occupation, unless we do something. We can't just say we have a two-state policy and then do absolutely nothing about it. We can't have a two-state policy and recognise only one. We can't say we believe in international accountability and then penalise the Palestinians every time they go to the ICC, the ICJ or any other international organisation. I mean, there has to come a point when this fig leaf of a policy, either we have to have the backbone to say this British policy is in words only and we have no intention of implementing it, which makes us hypocrites. And it's why I saw that hypocrisy in 2014 and felt that I could not be a part of that. Or we say we fundamentally believe in it and we start by recognising Palestine and bringing about two states.
Your former boss, David Cameron, who you were fond of, he was Foreign Secretary for much of this year. He came back into government to be the foreign minister. His big challenge was Gaza. A lot of people criticised Cameron for not following the legal advice. There's a big debate about what legal advice he was offered or whether the arms sales were legal. Do you believe there was, I don't want to use the phrase cover-up, but I'll use the phrase cover-up. Do you believe there was a cover-up in the British government? Because Labour have come in now and said, okay, we are going to suspend a minority of licence. It's a small step, but a step. Why did Cameron not follow the legal advice?
When David became a Foreign Sec, I actually thought it was a positive moment. I thought James Cleverly was terrible. I felt like there was no real sense of
His
somebody who
predecessor was Foreign
understood
Minister,
his predecessor. I felt that there was no sense of a grown-up who understood these issues. There was also no secret of David's relationship with Netanyahu, which he really doesn't have much time for him. And I felt like he understood the person he was dealing with in the Middle East and understood these issues. And remember, it was David Cameron who first used the phrase that Gaza is an open-air prison.
Yes.
And he talked about how these matters needed to be resolved. And actually, he started off well, started off strong, talked about the ceasefire, talked about the violence in the West Bank, talked about the sanctioning of those groups who were leading that violence. But there were almost two David Camerons. You see, this is the issue I've had with David Cameron throughout his career. On a personal level, I am incredibly fond of him. He's a thoroughly decent, nice human being, good person to work with, and actually leaves you to get on with your job. And is somebody who builds a broad church. But there were two David Camerons. There was the David Cameron pre-Christmas, and then there was the David Cameron post-Christmas. And I'm always fascinated. I'd just be fascinated to know which parties he went to over Christmas and New Year, because something fundamentally changed in his language and his approach from what happened in late 2023 to what happened post-early 2024. And I genuinely hope that this period, including the time when David was there, and now with the new Foreign Sec, David Lammy, I do hope that this period is put under a microscope, because if our politicians are not being led by our policy and our values and our commitment to the rule of law and international accountability, then that's a really dangerous place to be.
Do you believe the British government, and when I say British government, I mean the Conservative government of Sunak after October 7th, and now the Labour government of Keir Starmer, David Lammy, do you believe the British government is complicit in war crimes in Gaza?
I think that war crimes have been committed in Gaza, and I feel that we have not done enough to stop them.
But are we complicit in it by arming them?
I think that's a judgment that would have to be made.
I know, asking for your judgment.
But it's, I think
you're
it's
a private
really,
citizen now. You can tell me your views.
I think I'm also a lawyer, and I'm also somebody who served at the highest level, and therefore I am, cautious about how I use my language. But that's why I said it is important that this period of British policy making is scrutinised and put under the microscope, and it is made absolutely clear to the British people why we were making decisions that fundamentally do not seem to be in line with our own policy and our own values.
Let me ask you a non-legal question then. Do you believe this period in British government history and foreign policy is a moral stain on the UK?
Absolutely.
And just on the fallout in the UK, Muslims being demonised again, do you condemn terrorism? The questions come back with a vengeance with Hamas, like it was with Al-Qaeda after 7/7. How hard has it been to maintain Muslim-Jewish relations? You do a podcast with the Jewish comedian and author David Baddiel. How hard has that been? Has there been a backlash for you, for him, having those tricky conversations at a time when the two communities have probably never been further apart?
Almost any space where Jews and Muslims would talk and would meet stopped. I have never seen the amount of fractiousness between British Muslim and British Jewish relationships then during this period.
Same in the US.
And whereas we would normally ride out these difficult periods, we couldn't, and it's one of the reasons why we did this podcast. And it was brought to the table by Jemima Khan Goldsmith. She's got skin in the game. She was born Jewish. Her kids are born Muslim. Yeah. And we both felt that, David and I felt that there were conversations happening in Jewish homes and Muslim homes, but those conversations were not happening with each other. And there were lots of other people talking about Muslims and Jews, but Muslims and Jews were not talking publicly and openly, telling each other how they felt about these things and how they perceived what was happening. It was a really difficult conversation and continues to be in really difficult times. But I do say this, and I've said this to David and I've said this to Jemima. You know, the one thing that I took hope from in all of this misery over the last year is that I have never seen Muslims as grown up as they are at the moment. That the crazies within the Muslim community are a very tiny minority on the fringe, whereas actually the crazies within the British Jewish community are very much mainstream. It's editors of newspapers like the Jewish Chronicle, or it's even been senior religious
David
figures.
Baddiel quit, was one of the columnists who recently quit from the Jewish Chronicle after the Jewish Chronicle had to admit or were caught publishing articles that were based on fake sources in the Israeli government.
And this is something that
And an editor of the Jewish Chronicle who said outrageously Islamophobic things.
Exactly. And the editor of the Jewish News said outrageously racist things. And other people in senior positions, you know, people who are well-known celebrities within the Jewish community, you know, even attributed what happened in the Sydney mall attack to a Muslim. So there were lots of things happening. And I have said this openly to my
But you're not afraid about calling that out and getting the backlash?
I've spoken openly to my British Jewish friends, and I said, you know, you really have a problem with radicalization right now in your community. There's, you know, don't just look across at Israel and think that this is far-right extremist, fascist settlers and people like Ben Gvir and Smotrich. That ideology and that poison and toxicity is finding itself in the homes here in British Jewish families, in editorial newsrooms, in publications, in discussions. And that would worry me if I was British and Jewish, because look, we've been there, right? We've been there where we used to turn on the television and think, really? You know, these people are talking crazy stuff and apparently representing Muslims doing it.
I saw the chief rabbi attack Sadiq Khan in an outrageous way. So yes, you make a good point about the leadership is in a pretty extreme place right now. Just to wrap up, your book, Muslims Don't Matter, paints a pretty important but pretty bleak picture of what is going on. Just some of the chapter headings: blind injustice, unequal nation, right? But then you end it saying it is time to reset. You say, I believe we can. Just so we're solutions oriented. You've laid out the challenges, the problems, the history. What do you believe are the solutions to this challenge of Islamophobia, of demonization, of being on the cusp of 1920s, 1930s, but not actually being 1930s? How do we stop it?
Turn off the tap. Turn off the tap of poisoning the public discourse. Turn off the tap of disinformation. Turn off the tap of poisonous language and ideology. Yeah, but we have to be prepared to say that. Look, at the moment, what we're trying to do, people of good intent and good faith are mopping things up whilst the tap's still on. And until we go back and turn off the tap in government by making sure that we start treating Muslims and engaging with them like we engage with every other community, end the policy of disengagement, review, prevent, and go back to what it should be, which is safeguarding, stop demonizing and targeting Muslims, stop finding policies and ways in which we're constantly shutting down the civil society space for Muslim communities, looking again at things like closed material proceedings, end this horror of citizenship stripping, where effectively this country has now created, quoting Jacob Rees-Mogg of all people, a first class and a second class category of citizens, where people like my kids and your kids are being told, actually, you better always be the good Muslim and the good immigrant, otherwise we might just decide you no longer belong here anymore. You know, where we no longer abide by the rule of law, where the way in which you are punished for a crime is not based upon the crime that you've committed, but is based upon the heritage of your grandparents. These are deeply dangerous spaces. So yes, turn off the tap. That's what the government has got to do.
Given everything you've seen in your career, you've seen things in government on the international stage that most Muslims will never see or experience, given the access you've had. And they're not good things, I think it's fair to say. How do you stay hopeful?
I think what makes me Muslim is not the fact that I'm, you know, on the prayer mat 5 times a day. What makes me Muslim is the constant belief that human beings can be good and that we should have hope and that we should keep faith and we should constantly move forward in a positive way. And, you know, alhamdulillah, better times will be ahead. We have to have that belief. Otherwise, you know, how else would you function? And when I look at my kids and now my grandkids, and I have 4 wonderful grandkids now, I look at them and I think, we've got to keep fighting. And this is our home. And we've got to fight for our place in it.
Well, this book is certainly a call to arms, rhetorical call to arms. It's a fight, and I hope we, all of us win it. Baroness Warsi, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Did you like this video? Don't forget to subscribe to this YouTube channel and turn on notifications. For exclusive content and to support our independent, unfiltered journalism, head over to zeteo.com. Your support matters.